So today's presenter is going to be Glenn McConkey. He's at the University of Leeds, and his topic is going to talk about COVID-19 therapeutics and pandemic lessons and everything he's done since the beginning of COVID in the UK. So I'm going to give a brief 10-minute update and then switch it over to Glenn to talk about all the great work he's done. I always present this just in case we want to try to do an in-person meeting. COVID people are not as interested anymore, obviously, with COVID, but maybe think about long COVID meeting or something, sponsorships for that. Yeah, and then no new news and new papers, but I'm sure there'll be some popping up hopefully few. And again, with Al, some of you are already involved, but we're working on a long COVID a few long COVID case reports that people are interested in joining in and helping us out. Let us know. That could be something we get more and more people involved. So I'm just going to give only some brief news and updates as we go, just so I get enough time for Glenn to talk. But there hasn't been that much in the past week. I didn't see much for normal COVID news or acute COVID news, I should say. But this thing popped up that mentioned WHO was providing new vaccination guidances for the world. And I think the media jumped on it and said, well, the WHO doesn't advise anything for, vaccination for kids or teens or low risk anymore, which I think is kind of misleading. What they did say is, countries should consider, depending on their context, this is a quote from there, that, depending on whether they want to decide continuing vaccinating low risk groups, which I think they should say they should, but that's my opinion. So when the media reads this, they're saying that WHO says you don't have to vaccinate kids in low risk and teens anymore. And of course, places like Fox News completely distorts this and says no more vaccination for kids, which is not right. But this is something that they said, whether people agree with this or not, that's something I guess we would have to discuss later at a later time. But that's what they're saying. So this might lead to less vaccination, which is unfortunate, or less, getting your yearly or 6-month booster as you probably should be getting. But they do say, yes, if you're high risk, severe, older adults, you should definitely be getting your boosters and vaccine and continued yearly or bi-yearly 6 months vaccinations. This paper came out, earlier this week. Predicting, it's probably a no-brainer here for us, but it's predicting the vaccine effectiveness against severe COVID. Over time, they did a big analysis where they're looking at Delta, Omicron, and they looked at it compiled from, they said 15 different studies, but overall they say yes, indeed, vaccine effectiveness is still pretty strongly correlated with symptoms and a positive antibody response. So this is another paper showing the benefits of vaccine, which might not be paired with what the WHO is recommending. Some long COVID news. So in long COVID world, this Eric Topol had put up this in his blog, had, kind of an overview of what are currently being used to prevent long COVID, and I think some of the stuff we had discussed already. For example, the metformin paper that he discussed in there, I think I brought up a meeting or two ago, that was showing potential benefits for reducing long COVID impact. If you have long COVID, it'll get therapeutic. And then Paxlovid is a paper that I think we discussed last week or a couple weeks ago, showing in the study that showed that. And there's a vaccination one, the paper definitely we discussed last week, the large one that came on that showed a good cut, a risk. Cutting the risk of long COVID with vaccination is definitely something they said about, 42% in that paper. It was a large UK study that was done. But it's a good review if you want to look at what's out there. On potential ways of preventing long COVID and therapeutics that are currently floating around with publications. I think most of these have gone over in previous meetings. Another paper that came out, I think this was a few days ago here, 26, talking about neurological manifestations of long COVID based on acute COVID severity. Again, some of this stuff they compared hospitalized and non-hospitalized people who have passed for long COVID, and then they went over all the impact of people from long COVID symptoms, from fatigue, anxiety, all this stuff you see here from a figure from the paper. And then, of course, correlated, which is probably not a surprise to people, that people who are post-hospitalized have bigger impact on the neurological effects, due to their severity of their hospitalization and then longer time to recover or long COVID symptoms. But it's more like looking at the hospital records and correlating to things, which is nice to see. This might be of interest to the immune group. This paper came out yesterday. So they're talking about post-acute long COVID, basically post-acute sequelae of COVID-19, and they looked at the T cell populations and then the IgA responses. This is just a few figures from the paper. I went through this paper really quickly before the meeting, so I didn't know the details, but the basic gist is that they see for long COVID, looking purely at the immune population and T cells, they didn't look at like a lot of different factors, but one thing they see that they should see in long COVID, they show a consistent elevation of IL-6 and these other immune different cytokine factors during the acute disease increase, and then the risk to develop PASC, is related to that once you have this elevation here, which I think we see with our data in our paper too. So that's something that's interesting correlative and to our work. But then they looked at characterized, for example, the different populations of CD8 cells, CD4 cells, and so on, the ratio. And you can see here from this plot, for example, people who will develop PASC, have a higher regulation of CD8 cell population, the ratio you can see here. But then you can see, for example, for memory cells, you see some deficiencies happening in the PASC cells, which probably makes sense with what occurs in long COVID. You see that reduction happens in some of the CDT memory responses. And then here's the inflammatory responses. You can see the differences between PASC, the long COVID, versus acute, I guess, COVID, you can call it. And you can see the increases that happen as they're talked about here. Might not be a surprise for our people working in the inflammation group, but it's something to further confirm what we're seeing is true too. So I'm going to take a look at this paper. Okay, so that was just a brief news update, but just going through what the variant distributions are. Again, in the U.S., it's still the XBB.1.5, which is good. There's other variants floating way in the background, but nothing's outcompeting this. In the wastewater, we're still showing the downward trend, although here it seems to be a little maybe going up, but we've seen these little bumps in the lowering of case of the wastewater monitoring for SARS-CoV-2. Again, so even the wastewater is showing the XBB is dominant. From one county where I live, for example, they had a little bump, but it's coming back down again. And overall, where I live around Massachusetts, we see the decrease happening with hospitalizations, and case numbers, of course, are not as reliable anymore, but reporting of it, I should say. The wastewater is a good indication. This in the U.S., we see the XBB.1.5 is pretty much everywhere now, dominant. And most of the world is about the same. So again, I'm going through this quick to give Glenn enough time to talk about his work. But globally, we see the downward trend happening. Again, case numbers globally is not as reliable, but you can maybe go by hospitalizations or patient ICUs. You can see the downward trend. It's more of a macro level view of the general areas as opposed to this little mess here. But you can see hospitalization in the U.S. or South Korea is going down. New cases, again, case reporting is not as reliable as before, so maybe hospital admissions and ICUs, but to look at, you can see in general, these are a downward trend and not anywhere going up. With places that report this, not every country report these. Just one example from Europe, France, seems to have maybe a little uptake of hospital admission here, but you see these bumps that happen. Maybe it's just a bump that will go down eventually. US, we already went over. South America and Brazil, as I always say, Brazil. South American countries tend to follow what Brazil's happening, the trend there. Again, case numbers not as reliable, but at least there's no new deaths. They're not reporting hospital admissions or patient ICUs, unfortunately, so we can't see what's happening there. In Japan, when they had their huge spike a month or two ago, a couple of months ago, for that Omicron of the cases and hospitalization, ICU, and deaths, for them, they're pretty much going back down to, low number of ICU and patient and deaths happening. So that's a good sign there. But that's a general trend we see everywhere now. So whether it's an endemic or it's just a calm before another bump happening, I guess time will tell. Okay, so gonna go turn it over. I don't know if there's any quick questions or discussion over this before I turn it over to Glenn.